Good morning, everybody. Good morning. Welcome to Bellingrath Gardens and Home. It's lovely to see so many folks here. So I think we're in for a treat. I have a few announcements I want to make, and then I'll introduce Dr. Valentine. So I'm Todd Lasang. I think most of you have met me or at least seen my mug somewhere. So appreciate y'all being here. We're actually happy to see, where'd you go? Dr. Bill Barrett's also here. So if I mess up, Bill can take over. So I'd actually like to introduce two new staff members who we're excited to have on board. So over here against the wall, we have Jennifer, and Jennifer joined us Monday, and she is our new programs and events manager. So we're giving her a reprieve today. So I'm doing it, but Jennifer Batchelder, I should have said her last name, will be taking over all the work done by her predecessor, and we're thrilled to have her. And then over on this side, kind of at the corner of the wall, we have Stephen Messer, and Stephen is our new, let me get this right, cafe, security, and custodial manager. So if you think you do not have enough work to do, go talk to Stephen after, and he's happy to tell you what he's doing. He's also started on Monday, so he's still on the learning curve. But we're thrilled to see new staff members, and appreciate all the support you give us. It allows us to continue to grow. So after the presentation today, Sally wanted me to remind you that we have our lunch today, which is fried chicken, macaroni and cheese, and mixed vegetables. You can see my priority of what I like to eat. So, and then also this evening we have our evening stroll at 5 till 7, and we're going to have two presentations by Barbara Smith on succulent panels. So these wall panels you can create with succulents. So if you'd like to come back later, we're going to have that. Okay. Unless there's any questions, I'm going to introduce Dr. Valentine. So we're really excited today to have Dr. Valentine over. He is the executive director of the Dauphin Island Sea Lab, and he's also a professor at the University of South Alabama. Prior to being named executive director, he was in charge of the Sea Lab's university programs. So I love when you have this connection between academia and research, and also public interface. And let's see, he's written over or co-authored over 95 grant proposals for his research work. And support for this research has come from federal and state agencies, including the National Science Foundation, NOAA, the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, the EPA, the Alabama Department of Conservation and Natural Resources, the Mobile Bay National Estuary Program, and the Nature Conservancy. So that's pretty amazing. It's not easy to get grants from these big organizations, y'all. And it says in 2015, he was awarded a $6.5 million grant to study the role of biodiversity in determining the resiliency of the Gulf of Mexico after the Deepwater Horizon disaster. So very important work there. I was looking up some of his publications yesterday, and there were whole new terms I've never seen before. I don't even remember them, so I need to look at them again. But I knew what benthic organisms were, and I knew a few of these other things that deal with marine sciences and sediment creatures and all this stuff. But I know we're going to be delighted. And just to also say, I'm looking forward to the days in the future where we can work with the Dauphin Island Sea Lab. We're obviously relative close proximity to each other. We're kind of the main things on this side of the bay. So I'm really excited to have John here, and thank you for being here, sir. And I'm going to stop talking. Go ahead.
I want to thank everybody for giving me the opportunity to come and chat today. And this is one of my favorite places to be, because when I think about biological diversity, one of the places that comes to mind is Bellingrath Gardens, because of the remarkable kinds of plants that you have here, and by extension, birds and butterflies and things like that come with those plants. I'm also not going to kid myself into thinking that all of you turned out just to hear me talk about biodiversity. I know this is all about Bill Barrett, so I've had the opportunity to see him since he retired. Bill was roommates with one of my board members. I have 5 members of my executive committee, new presidents of Alabama, Auburn, South Alabama, Jack Hawkins, of course, at Troy, and John Stewart at Montevallo. Bill was the president of Auburn's roommate at one point in the past. And Bill was so impressive that Jay gave up biology and went ahead and went into administration at the university. So, and I'll tell Jay I said that this afternoon. So, just for a little background, I thought that I would start out and give you a quick overview of what the Sea Lab is, because even though we're close and nearby, we don't always communicate about what our priorities are. And I think from my initial conversation with Todd, I think we're going to be able to change that. I want to talk to you about the economic and ecological importance of the Gulf of Mexico writ large with 5 states. Then I want to talk about disturbance, because there's natural and there's anthropogenic or man-made disturbances, and we live in a world that biology is always being challenged by these kind of events, whether it's Hurricane Katrina or Deepwater Horizon or whatever. And then I want to talk a little bit about how the Gulf responds to disturbance, just let you see. And that's really the theme that biodiversity has become. And we're very active with the Smithsonian Institution and what's called the Marine Geo efforts, which are studying the role of biological diversity in determining recovery of natural ecosystems in the years that follow. And then I want to bring this home to Mobile County and talk to you about a biodiversity hotspot that we have here, and that's the Mobile Tensaw Delta. So that's a bunch, but I'm good at getting through this stuff. So the Sea Lab is the administrative home, if you will, for what's called the Marine Environmental Sciences Consortium. We're 50 years old now, and the intention of President Whidden and a collection of other presidents at the time was to have a single entity that would focus on coastal and marine studies in Alabama. And what we do is we maximize the capacity of all the investigators that are found throughout the state. We provide them an aggressive undergraduate marine science program. We have graduate programs. Right now we have 120 undergraduates that are on our campus taking various courses that are science electives for their degrees back home. And we're the only institution that provides that information. We've got about 40 full-time graduate students that are on the campus. And then I've got 15 PhDs that are working on various things. You've heard of the Great Snapper Count recently. We're a big part of that. The oyster restoration work, the assessments of Deepwater Horizon, things like that. We were involved in all those pieces. So we do this through a number of ways. And one of them is public education or community engagement. And I know Todd's got a program like this. Right now we're talking to people through our public aquarium, which will be rebranded this year to the Alabama Aquarium. Next week I'm going to Montgomery. The governor signed a bill that's going to designate us the official aquarium of Alabama, so that's a big deal. Because just like you, in terms of raising funds, this gives us an opportunity to chase tourism support to modernize our exhibits, just like I heard Todd mention a few minutes ago. We have a very strong Discovery Hall program. It's a K-12 program that brings in students from all 67 counties around the state. On average, we have 10 to 12,000 K-12 students on the campus. We understand, too, as all of you know, that Alabama is pretty poor in certain segments of the community. And so we take the show on the road to the Title I schools because they can't even afford the gas to come down to lower Alabama. So we take the show on the road and we reach another 10,000 or so students every year. We do teacher training, we do workshops, we do all kinds of things through that program. And then the college programs, which is where I come from. And we do basic and applied research. And we do that everywhere from the Arctic all the way down to the Antarctic. We're in the Caribbean commonly. We've been in the Baltic, the Mediterranean. We do all kinds of things. We put a big effort in Western Australia a few years back. And if you want a long flight, try that one out. And then I mentioned the undergraduate education. We're going to be expanding that probably with a fall term now. Historically, we've run from May through August, but we're at capacity right now. So we're going to have to do something to address that issue. So, America, in terms of the Gulf of Mexico, we're probably one of the best kept secrets in Washington. You seldom hear them talking about Washington until Senator Shelby became the chair of appropriations, and then the word started getting out. We've got some 47,000 miles among these 5 states that make our part of the Gulf of Mexico up in terms of miles of shoreline and contact. I'd say that's low because the biggest watersheds in the continental United States empty into the Gulf of Mexico. And if you track from the Alabama-Mississippi border all the way up our watershed to Tennessee and Mississippi, you find that we have a pretty darn large shoreline. And we're working now with Alabama Water Institute on how to promote that. Major efforts coming out of Tuscaloosa. In terms of wetlands, we got half of the nation's wetlands down here. We've got an enormous amount of wetlands. Seagrasses, which are critical nursery habitats for recreational and commercial species. You can see them more so over in Baldwin County, but we have them all around here. They're just hard to see in this turbid water. We've got 90% of the nation's seagrasses down here. We've got mangroves. Here, Todd and I were just talking about that. Mangroves are showing up in the Chandelier Islands. We've had a couple of attempted recruits here on Dauphin Island. And the reason we think that that's happening is basically the climate's warming up. And that's a hot topic in my business, what's called tropicalization. We're seeing more snook. One of our bird folks just found roseate spoonbills that are nesting here in the area. You know, some things are starting to happen. We've got mangrove snapper. So look for some things to change. And the good news is most of the stuff tastes good with butter. So we've got over a third of the coral reefs. While you know a lot about the Florida Keys and all the remarkable coral that's down there, what's left of it, but right up here off the Florida Panhandle is an area called the Florida Middle Ground. And those corals there on about 80 feet of water are identical to what you would see in the state of Florida, in southern Florida. And then we have amazing deep water communities that are driven by methane, not by light, but by methane. And that kind of gives people some hope that NASA's going to find something, one of the moons out of Europe. So it's not all about an inventory of ecology. And this is something I talk about an awful lot when I'm in Washington. We have incredibly productive fisheries in the Gulf of Mexico. About 1.3 billion pounds of seafood are harvested every year in our 5-state area. Dockside value is almost $700 million, just a huge impact. We get 85% of the nation's shrimp and about 2/3 of the nation's oysters. So the ecology and the science are really important, but the economy is equally important, especially as the politics of America are shifting. We need to learn how to speak to everybody, and dollars is the one common denominator we have. So I mentioned disturbances. For those of you that have been here a while, you know what I'm talking about, and we're just about to enter the season. We were all exchanging emails, lab directors, and the quote was, "And so it begins." And we're talking about the arrival of the first tropical event this coming weekend. And it illustrates to me, as you look at Katrina here, really how small the Gulf is relative to these things. So what affects people in Texas certainly affects us when these things come ashore, and the disturbances are just amazing. In our place, just from Hurricane Sally, we've got probably $5 million worth of damage we've got to fix, and we're trying to fix it in a post-COVID world where bids are just outrageous on repairs. Building stock and jobs, it's a busy thing. So not everything negative that happens to the Gulf is a man-made disturbance. There's a lot of natural stuff. Freshwater inflow. If you remember how much it rained this spring, Mobile Bay was almost a freshwater lake, and that's pretty tough for marine organisms to live in. And then this is where I came in terms of administration, was Deepwater Horizon. 7 people lost their lives that April when this hit the ground. And it triggered an amazing amount of research because of the penalties that came out of the settlement with BP. Some $500 million in research money was set aside to work on the Gulf. Up until that point, we were the poor cousin of everything that happened on the Atlantic and in the Pacific. And so what we're learning about the Gulf is just remarkable. And one of the questions and my challenge is how bad was the damage and can we recover from it? And that's where today's theme comes up, biological diversity, because biological diversity is thought to buffer against all of these dramatic disturbances. I would be without miss, and I'm just giving props to my daughter at the moment, but if you're watching the news, you see the Chinese have been caught with illegal fishing everywhere. They got caught in the Galapagos, turning off their identifiers and trawling through the Galapagos, turning back on the next morning. They just got caught in Argentina, and my daughters, who Bill met a long time ago, is the champion for this with an NGO called Oceana. So men of all kinds are harvesting resources at incredible rates, mostly illegally. And when they do that, they change the structure of coastal ecosystems and the food webs. And when they reach a certain threshold, ecosystems tend to collapse. And that also is a confounding factor. And if you read Amazon or any of the books, this is what we're considered to be now entering the 6th extinction. The other 5 were either due to asteroids or low oxygen events that were created a long time ago. But Richard Leakey, who's the same guy who found the link with apes in Olduvai Gorge, who was one of the authors, basically there's a mass extinction going on. So why do we care? It's all about biological diversity. And biological diversity, in the simplest way I can explain it, is about variety. If you think back to Darwin, think about how many passenger pigeons he took a look at trying to get his theories together. Think about how many corals he worked with, barnacles, you name it. He understood that early, that there was no one group of organisms. It was a collection of many, many species. And it's that diversity and the replacement of these species that allows our Gulf to recover when these events happen. But this is simple because in the literature for science and primary literature, we characterize biological diversity a whole lot of different ways. Ultimately, what we're most interested in is genetic diversity. And how strong are you in terms of what's called heterozygosity? And what that does is it allows you to recover to things. And just think how much you've learned about the coronavirus and how important genetic diversity is as this bug turns into from one kind of bug to another kind of bug. Genes are moving and they're responding to what we're doing. We see already the effects of the vaccine. New strains are popping up that are somewhat resistant to the shots that we've got. Species diversity, that's what we talk about the most. How many different hibiscuses do you have? How many different azaleas do you have? How many different flies come and land on those things while you're admiring? You get my point. There's a lot of variety out there. Communities is where all the species come together and they interact. Mobile Bay would probably be considered a community. There's ecosystems, and we're going to talk about the Delta in just a few minutes. And then landscapes, which are assemblages of ecosystems. And that would be something like the watershed that goes all the way to Tennessee, Mississippi, and Georgia. So there's a lot of hierarchy that goes into the conversation. And as I just mentioned, when we talk about species diversity or biological diversity, it's frequently damn hard to tell which species is which and whether they're the same or whether they're different. And so I just brought that out to make the point. We all know Siberian Huskies and Dobermans, and most of the time you never see them getting along. But so why does this work? So stability in ecosystems is largely determined by interconnectedness. And these red lines sort of illustrate a simple model food web. And we did this at our lab. The fewer the connections between species that you have in a community, the more likely it is that it will be unstable. You remove 2 or 3 of these links, this whole system collapses. You move 2 or 3 links from this food web, and there's still the opportunity for it to rebound and move forward because you have so many more links between things. So connectiveness and linkages in food webs are really a big deal. And that's where that comes from. So again, and this is just some shots from our local places where we have salt marshes and oysters, and this is a trawling shot. The richer the ecosystem is in terms of that interconnection and that biological diversity, the more stable it's going to be. Okay? So we bounced back from Deepwater Horizon. Much to my shock, it happened quickly. You know, and it was really odd going back to the landscape and the ecosystem stuff. We were out collecting fish within weeks. And if you read all the headlines that were coming out, CNN, everybody was down here, you would have thought the Gulf was dying. It was just amazing how negative all the information was that was coming out. But when we were pulling those nets, I was getting 3 times the number of fish that I would have gotten before the oil spill happened. And in terms of the amount of weight, which we call biomass, the amount of biomass I was getting on my boat was similarly 3 to 4 times lower. We had 12 times more tiger sharks that showed up out in our area. I couldn't figure it out. And I kept thinking this was because Noah closed the Gulf to fishing, if you remember all of that. I thought that this was kind of pointing a finger at the commercial fishermen at the time. And I thought it was bycatch. But what I realized later with some accidents that I did, the fish had gotten up and left Louisiana, and they'd come over to Alabama where the conditions weren't so bad. Who says those Cajuns can't figure stuff out? Only Nick Saban is a challenge for them. So, you know, that's where the landscape issue comes in that I mentioned, the ecosystem meshes come in. You've got to do your studies at an appropriately large scale to really get a handle on how biological diversity works. And it wasn't until I figured out that they had left Louisiana and moved over here for the summer that I started to understand more about the landscape piece. So let's talk about a hot spot. This is the one that I spent a lot of time in when I wasn't working on coral reefs and seagrasses, and it's the Mobile-Tensaw Delta. And it's about 300 square miles in coverage. On the Forever Wild Board, we own half. The state of Alabama owns half of the Delta. We've been able to purchase and set aside anything that shows up that has water next to it that somebody's trying to sell to the state. I make sure that gets a priority because that affects all of us. And I don't care if it's up by Guntersville Lake or Tennessee or wherever. If it's abutting a river or stream or whatever, that's something I'm going to fight for. You've got 32 miles of open water in that 300 or so square miles. What's amazing is how extraordinary the diversity of the habitats are. Just in terms of open water, 20,000 acres or so of fresh water that are there. Marshes, the diversity of plants up there is just phenomenal. The lilies, the whole 9 yards, the irises, you name it. It's just amazing. Go up in the spring, take a day. Most beautiful lilies you'd ever see. Rose mallows, which are related to hibiscus, are up there. There's lotuses, you name it. There is something amazing for you to see up there. There's almost 11,000 acres of freshwater mixed marsh up there. Just amazing. We've got 70,000 acres of swamps of all kinds. And the definitions get a little funny between what's a swamp and what's a mixed marsh, but it still adds to the story. And then about 85,000 acres of mixed bottomland forest. You see the cypresses up there. You see all kinds of things. And I tended to make the case that the reason that delta was so productive was because of the diversity of habitats that are up there. Each one of these things has probably got 20 or 30 species of plants that are embedded within there. The seagrasses, when you talk in the marine world, in the ocean, we're talking about 3 species of seagrass. You got turtle grass, you got widgeon, you got rupia. When you go up in the delta, there's 20 of them. Just amazing, the diversity of things. And I'll show you what a picture of what they look. We would have called those weeds when I was a kid. We'd want to rip them up and get them out of the waves because they were affecting our swimming. But they're really important ecologically. This is just a picture to show you some of the what's called functional diversity. This is an exotic species. This is the milfoil you hear about that gets on people's boats and they spread all over the place. Stargrass, heteranthera, this is Valentine, big native grass. The diversity of structure is really high. And because of that diversity in structure, small animals of all kinds can hide between those leaves and they keep the predators from getting to them. And I always like this one because this reminds me that big predators come to those kinds of habitats to feed on whatever they can catch. And it's a pretty true story. And that one I'll come back to in a minute, but you've got sunfish, you've got largemouth bass, and then you turn around and look, you're getting bull sharks and mangrove snapper and flounder and bluefish up there. What a giant mixing zone that is. If you like birds, I don't know how many of you are like birds, there's 300 species of birds up there. That is a lot of birds, and they're of all kinds. Salamanders, toads, there's 40 of those altogether. Reptiles, if you remember, we were so well known for turtles that poachers were coming into the delta and taking the turtles and selling them to the Chinese. They were doing it on the market. We've got one alligator, and I can tell you there are a lot of alligators. If you want to treat, go out there at night with a flashlight on that boat. And they hiss too. I was trying to stick GPS trackers on them. Yeah. I mean, everybody's got their wild hair, and that was mine. And we were bringing them up. We put tape over their eyes. We get their legs together, and we would drill through the shells to put the thing. They only lasted a month, but that night we had Jeff Duke with us. We were showing the camera. We were taking photos of all the lights and things, and you could see the eyes. And there wasn't a square inch of that marsh edge that didn't have an alligator on it looking out and trying to. So it got hairy enough that we went ahead and hired guys from alligator farms to collect them for us. And we quit doing that. But you get the message. There is a lot of diversity up there. It's one of the most remarkable places the state of Alabama has. Here's just a few plants for all of you. We've got reed grasses, Aaron's arrow, rose mallow. You know, there's just a whole bunch of things. And in terms of the fish, I mentioned the freshwater fish. There's 310 species of known fishes in the state of Alabama. That's a lot of fish. Almost half of those are down here. So you've got these freshwater fishes of all kinds. Orange spot sunfish is gorgeous this time of year, bluegills, largemouth bass. We've got paddlefish. You name it. We've got all kinds of things that are up here. And by the same token, in that exact same square mile where I was collecting things, we had anchovies, we had bull sharks that surprised the dickens out of me, blue crabs, speckled trout, redfish, you name it. It is just one giant mixing zone. It's about as cool a place as you can possibly work. But moving on that hierarchical scale that I mentioned, I wanted to come back to the habitats for a minute because sometimes you think they're just swamps and they have no value to you at all, economically or otherwise. And this is an infrared I got from a tidal freshwater marsh that's up there. And it's got a mixture of submerged grasses in here with it. But these things do for you something that a nutrient tank can't do. I'm losing my words here. Sewer treatment plant. They remove 50% of all the nitrogen that comes from the watershed. And you care about nitrogen because nitrogen triggers macroalgal blooms that occur. And macroalgal blooms shade and cover. Oh, I got to get in front of my X here. They cover these things, and at night, you may not know this, and we found this by accident. You know that they produce a lot of oxygen because they're plants, but not at night. At night, the photosynthetic cycle reverses, and they start consuming nitrogen, and they're producing CO2, among other things. And the marshes that are overgrown by the macroalgae that's not removed from the nitrogen, those things have no oxygen in them at all at night. And I never got a chance to go any further with that because I was curious how many things that hide in those grasses during the day get up and leave and go out, and that the predators are following that oxygen cycle and catching them as they're coming out. But we never quite got to that. We did find a bit of a story there, but it needs a good bit more work. Here's just an example of what it looks like up in the Delta, places where we don't get the nitrogen. You can see Mobile in the background there. And these things really, really cause a lot of problems. And this is that heteranther I just showed you, the star plant, and it's flowering. So plants do pretty good with this, but the animals not so much. So it's a pretty good story. I mean, it's a remarkable resource. The biological diversity is sky high there. It seems to be pretty darn resilient. You know, Jimmy Lyons and I had a deal where as long as he stayed on the Mobile River, I quit badmouthing state docks, and he promised me he wouldn't call me a tree hugger publicly. So it worked out pretty good. But there are things that are a bit alarming. And this graph just is one of my graduate students did this. And the data start around 1910 and run through 2000. And this is just a plot of ducks, the waterfowl counts that were made back in the day. It's kind of one of the few long-term data sets we can see. But you can't miss the red line. The numbers of waterfowl are dramatically less than they were historically. Why that is not clear. The duck hunters will say it's because all the ponds that are up there. Another possibility is we've degraded some habitats that they really like. So something to be a little concerned about. This is another invasive species. I showed you milfoil a minute ago. Look at how that covers up your crop. And that's how I first got involved in this. I don't know if any of you knew Sage Lyons when he was the chief of staff for the governor. This stuff was messing up his fishing holes. And he was willing to pay with your money to get me to go out there and see what I could do about that. But there's not too much we can do about it. There is something, and Bill's heard me say this at a Rotary Club meeting. It's not just the nutrient story. You know about the causeway, and I'll show you a shot of it in just a minute. The causeway serves like a breakwater. And so with the winds blowing from the south, the wave action is breaking on that causeway. And what we discovered in the case of the milfoil, let's see if there it is right there. What we discovered in the case of the milfoil was that in areas that had high wave action, there was no milfoil. But they'd be right next to an area where there'd be just a bunch of it. So we took out dynamometers, we started measuring wave energy and things like that. So in this case, and why you need science, because these bridges are $20 million a pop, is that the wind comes up and it just disrupts these large leafy plants, and it just removes them and creates open. You're never going to get rid of hydrilla now. We're never going to get rid of milfoil. We're not going to get rid of lionfish. Those things are here, and we just have to figure out how to deal with them. But this is an example at the landscape level of what biodiversity looks like. So I'm going to stop with that. I could go on for 2 or 3 days, but I don't want to ruin your afternoon. If you got any questions, I just go back to the message I started out in the beginning, and this is something I will be pounding this theme in Montgomery soon again, and I'll be doing it over in Orange Beach on July 9th. It's not the environment or the economy, which used to be a political position that was frequently heard in the community. It's not about jobs versus the environment. Because what I learned in an economic paper I wrote during the Deepwater Horizon experience, just the simple perception that the Gulf was sick, just the perception is created by the mass media, created the impression to tourism that it wasn't safe for them to come to Dauphin. They still are having that same problem of harmful algal blooms, something we're going to start looking at in the next year. So these things are linked at the hip. And in order to have a strong economy, you're going to have a clean environment. So that's the message I have for the mayor of Orange Beach and the mayor of Gulf Shores, and that's coming up July 9th. So that's it.
Thank you.